Get your hands where I can see them, boy, and don't you dare reach for anything unless I tell you to." The voice came before the flashlight did. Low, practiced. The voice of a man who had said those exact words so many times that they had stopped meaning anything to him at all. A man for whom the words were simply the opening notes of a song he had been singing for 18 years, without ever once being asked to stop. Marcus Cole sat behind the wheel of his 2018 Chevy Impala with both hands visible at 10 and 2. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes watched the blue and red lights strobe across his dashboard in the rearview mirror, and the expression on his face was not fear and was not anger, but was something much more controlled than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting 11 nights for exactly this moment, and who was now simply letting the moment arrive. He had been circling Sergeant Dale Hargrove's patrol route through the Cloverfield district every night for nearly 2 weeks. Same car, same 3-block loop, same speed, tags current, taillights functional, registration immaculate, giving Hargrove absolutely nothing legitimate to act on, and trusting based on 340 pages of prior complaint records he had memorized that Hargrove would not need anything legitimate. The rain was falling on Cloverfield the way it always fell in November. Not in sheets, not dramatically. Just a thin, persistent drizzle that made every surface slick and every shadow deeper. The kind of rain that didn't wash anything clean but simply redistributed the grime from one surface to another, the way certain institutions redistribute harm without ever actually reducing it. The button on the lapel of his jacket was not a button. It was a high-definition, wide-angle lens, no larger than a thumbnail embedded in a casing visually indistinguishable from the other buttons on the jacket. Currently transmitting live 4K video and audio through an encrypted channel to a secure federal server at the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., where 2 agents were monitoring the feed in real time, logging every second with a timestamp that would later become the backbone of a federal prosecution. Sergeant Dale Hargrove walked toward the Impala with the unhurried stride of a man who had never once been surprised by the outcome of a traffic stop. Large man, barrel chest, silver blonde hair gone gray at the roots. The kind of hair that caught every available light and held it gleaming under the street lamp like something that had been polished rather than grown. His hand rested on his belt without quite touching the holster, a position that was not quite a threat, but was never quite not one either. The ambiguous posture of a man who understood that suggestion was more powerful than action. His rookie partner, Officer Kevin Bryce, took up a position at the passenger side of the Impala without speaking. Young enough that his face still showed what he was thinking. And what he was thinking, watching Marcus's hands visible and unmoving on the wheel, was something he was not yet experienced enough to name, but would spend the next 3 months trying to forget. Marcus lowered his window. The drizzle came in immediately, cold against his left cheek. He said nothing. Cloverfield was a working-class black neighborhood pressed against the southwestern edge of Harmon City. The kind of place where the corner stores closed early because the owners had learned not from statistics, but from lived experience that staying open after dark invited the kind of attention that cost more than a few extra hours of revenue. The kind of place where the sidewalks were wide and mostly empty at night, not because people weren't home, but because being outside after dark in Cloverfield meant being visible. And being visible meant being available. Residents here had learned over decades that a traffic stop after dark was not a minor inconvenience. It was a roll of dice. Mothers told their sons exactly what to do with their hands before they taught them to drive, because the lesson about hands came first. It had always come first. The lesson went like this, both hands on the wheel visible at all times. Say yes, sir, and no, sir. Even if it costs you something to say it. Don't reach for anything without announcing exactly what you're reaching for. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't argue even if you're right. Come home. Just come home. Marcus Cole had grown up 40 minutes from here. He had never forgotten that lesson. The 11 nights on Cloverfield Boulevard had not been a test of his patience. They had been a meditation on what it cost an entire neighborhood to pass down a lesson like that from one generation to the next, and to never once see the system that required the lesson held responsible for requiring it. 3 blocks from where Marcus sat in his Impala in a small brick row house on Denison Street, a woman named Loretta Shaw was sitting in her living room in a straight-backed chair with the television on and the sound turned low. She was 58 years old. She wore her good coat, the gray wool one she kept for court appearances, draped over the arm of the chair beside her. Laid out for tomorrow. On the mantel above the electric fireplace, between a photograph of Loretta at her retirement from the post office and a small ceramic vase her mother had given her, there was a photograph of a young man in a green community college hoodie smiling at someone just to the left of the camera. His name was Jerome Shaw. He was her son. He was 29 years old, and he was currently in year 2 of a 5-year sentence at Bridgewater Correctional, 300 miles north of the city, for possession with intent to distribute and illegal possession of a firearm. He had been 3 semesters into a business administration degree at Harmon City Community College when Sergeant Dale Hargrove pulled him over on a Tuesday night in October 2 years ago. He had been working nights at a loading dock on the east side of the city, saving money for tuition, calling his mother every Thursday after his late shift ended. The drugs Hargrove said he found were found under the driver's seat. The gun Hargrove said he found was found in the same location. The language Hargrove used in his report was precise and familiar. Jerome had been convicted on Hargrove's testimony alone and sentenced in 9 days. Loretta had come to the precinct to beg. She had stood in the lobby in her good coat and asked to speak with someone who could tell her what her son had actually done to deserve this. And what Hargrove had said to her, not loudly, not with cruelty, but with the flat indifference of a man who had said the same thing many times before, was that Cloverfield was his district and that the people of Cloverfield had been safe for 18 years because he made sure they knew he didn't need a reason. He needed a result. She had never told anyone what he said. Not because she was afraid, because she knew that telling it would cost her more than she could afford and change nothing that needed to change. Tomorrow, she was going to sit in the courtroom gallery and watch Dale Hargrove testify again, in the same cadence, with the same words, against a man she had never met. She turned off the television at 10 o'clock. She laid out her good shoes beside the coat. She did not sleep well, but she did not expect to. 3 blocks away, Kevin Bryce stood at the passenger side of a Chevy Impala in the thin November rain and watched a man's hand stay perfectly still on a steering wheel and thought about the decision he was going to have to make before this night was over. "License and registration," Hargrove said. The flashlight cut directly into Marcus's eyes. Not at his hands, not at the interior of the car, at his face. A small and deliberate discourtesy that communicated everything about the kind of stop this was going to be. "It's in the glove box, officer," Marcus said, his voice level carrying a quality that Hargrove could not have named, but that unsettled him in a way he would not have admitted to anyone. "I am reaching for it now." Hargrove took the license and studied it with the performance of a man looking for something he already knew wasn't there. His eyes moved between the laminated card and Marcus's face with the practiced rhythm of someone buying time to make a decision he had already made before he ever touched his light bar. Then he handed the license back and said in a voice utterly devoid of any pretense of justification that he could smell marijuana, and that Marcus needed to step out of the car. Marcus had never smoked a day in his life. He stepped out of the car. The rain was steady and cold, soaking through his jacket immediately. He turned toward the hood of the Impala as directed and placed his hands on the wet metal and stood there perfectly still. While behind him, he heard Hargrove making a quiet sound. Not words, just a sound. The sound of a man whose body had performed a particular motion so many thousands of times that the motion no longer required any conscious decision. A dip of the shoulder, a reach into the vest, a retrieval. Marcus watched all of it unfold in the reflection of the car's wet hood. The image distorted by rain and the orange light of the nearest street lamp into something that looked almost abstract, almost like something other than what it was, except that Marcus knew exactly what it was. Because he had studied Hargrove's prior complaints long enough to know precisely how this man moved and precisely what this motion meant. 3 seconds. It took Hargrove 3 seconds to retrieve the baggie and the revolver from his own tactical vest and lean into the open driver's door of the Impala and place both items under the seat. And when he straightened up and said, "Well, well," in the flat, satisfied voice of a man performing for an audience of one, Marcus's expression did not change by a single degree. "Look what we have here," Hargrove said, holding up the evidence for Bryce to see. A clear, plastic baggie of white powder and a snub-nosed .38 revolver with the serial number filed off. Bryce looked at the items, then looked at Marcus, then looked at the ground. The decision he made in that 3-second window to look at the ground instead of at Hargrove was a decision he would replay every night for the next 3 months until he could no longer sleep. "Officer Bryce bagged this," Hargrove said. "We got possession with intent and an illegal firearm." Bryce said, "Sarge, I didn't see that in the bag it." Bryce opened the evidence bag. Hargrove wrenched Marcus's arms back and the cuffs clicked tight around his wrists. Then Hargrove leaned close enough that Marcus could smell the stale coffee on his breath and the cold damp of his uniform, and said into Marcus's ear in a voice designed never to travel beyond the two of them, "You're going away for 10 years, boy. Don't worry about the car. The city'll auction it off before you're done with your first week." Marcus turned his head just enough to look directly at Hargrove's face from 3 inches away. His voice was quiet and completely even when he said, "Make sure you spell my name right on the report, Sergeant." Hargrove laughed, a short, hard sound like something breaking, and shoved Marcus toward the cruiser. As Marcus walked with the cuffs pressing into his wrists and the rain soaking through to his skin, he felt the small, steady warmth of the transmitter battery pressed against his chest. And he thought about the server in Washington receiving every frame of what had just happened. And he thought about the scratch on the barrel of that revolver. A long diagonal scratch that ran from the grip to the muzzle, that he had already documented in a federal affidavit from photographs taken 6 weeks earlier. When Hargrove had used that same weapon to plant on a 23-year-old named Damon Rivers, who was currently in his 8th month of a 5-year sentence at Bridgewater Correctional. Marcus had needed Hargrove to do this on camera. He had needed the lie to exist on federal record. Now it did. The monitoring room smelled of stale coffee and the specific kind of silence that collects in spaces where people have been watching screens for a very long time. It was on the 4th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building off a hallway that saw very little foot traffic after 9 in the evening. 2 agents, Chen and Vasquez, sat at adjacent workstations with their headsets on and their attention fixed on 2 separate feeds, both originating from the same button, on the same jacket, on the same dark street in Harmon City, 312 miles away. They had been doing this for 11 nights. They knew the shape of Cloverfield Boulevard by now. They knew the sound of Hargrove's cruiser. They had learned to read Marcus's silences the same way you learn to read the silences of someone you've listened to for a long time, not with analysis but with the instinctive recognition of familiarity. When the rear door of the monitoring room opened, both agents straightened without being asked. A Sandra Okafor walked in and stood behind them without speaking for a long moment, watching the feed. She was a compact woman with close-cropped natural hair and the particular quality of presence that does not require height or volume, the kind of authority that arrives in a room before the person carrying it does and stays after they leave. She had been with the Bureau for 19 years. She had built Operation Clean Ledger from a single complaint filed by a public defender in Harmon City who had noticed that the language in Hargrove's arrest reports was not just similar across cases, it was identical, word for word, across different defendants, different vehicles, different nights. The same word, order. The same sequence. The same planted items described in the same language found in the same location. A pattern so deeply embedded in the operation of the Cloverfield precinct that it had become invisible to everyone inside it, including eventually the prosecutors who relied on it, and the judges who signed off on it, and the juries who believed it, because the institution had been built around it so gradually that the pattern had become the institution. Okafor had spent 6 months building the evidentiary architecture that would make Hargrove's world visible to people who had never had to live inside it. She watched the feed. She watched Marcus's hands on the hood of the Impala. She watched Hargrove's shoulder dip. She watched the 3-second plant. She did not close her eyes. She did not look away. The scope of what was documented in this room was real and specific and enormous. 31 cases where Hargrove's testimony had been the primary or sole evidence for conviction. 24 defendants still incarcerated their names on a list that Okafor had read so many times she could recite it from memory. The planted revolver documented and tied by federal forensic analysis to 3 prior victims, including Damon Rivers and a 17-year-old named Corey Weston, who had pled guilty to avoid trial and was serving 18 months at a juvenile facility. The decision not to stop the operation tonight, not to call in a team to pull Marcus out the moment the plant happened, not to have him show the badge and walk away clean was not a comfortable decision. It was not the kind of decision that felt good in the making of it. But it was the necessary one. If Marcus showed his badge tonight, Hargrove would let him go, might apologize, might even, in some part of himself that had not yet been entirely consumed by 18 years of impunity, mean the apology. And then, tomorrow night on some other block in Cloverfield, he would do the same thing to someone who didn't have a badge or a wire or a federal operation built around their testimony. The 24 men on the list needed Hargrove to do this in a courtroom, under oath, in front of a jury, on federal record. Only then would the weight of what had been done to them become legally irreversible, not a complaint, not an allegation, but a documented lie sworn before God in the United States District Court. Okafor looked at the feed one more time before she set her coffee cup down on the workstation beside Chen. Marcus was in the back of the cruiser now, rain on the windows, hands cuffed behind his back, looking at nothing in particular with the flat patient expression of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. She said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. The booking room at the Cloverfield precinct smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the specific staleness of a space that was kept functional rather than habitable, the smell of a place where people were processed rather than seen. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious awareness. A television in the break room down the hall was playing a late-night sports recap, the commentary rising and falling in muffled waves. The duty officer at the booking desk was a heavyset man named Finley, who had been doing this job for 14 years, and who processed Marcus with the mechanical efficiency of someone for whom the work had long since ceased to require attention. Fingerprints, photograph, property inventory. The items moved from Marcus's pockets and sealed in a clear plastic bag, a wallet, a phone, a set of keys, a folded receipt from a gas station on the east side of the city. The button from his lapel, still warm from the transmitter battery, was placed in the bag with the rest without examination, without comment. Marcus answered every question asked of him with complete accuracy and no elaboration. He did not invoke his right to remain silent because silence was not what this moment required. What this moment required was cooperation so thorough and so documented that no subsequent narrative could characterize his behavior as anything other than what it was, the behavior of a man who had nothing to hide and who knew it. Down the hall in the break room, Dale Hargrove was holding court. He had changed out of his wet jacket and was sitting at the small table near the coffee machine with his feet stretched out and his voice carrying the easy volume of a man performing for an audience that he believed was in complete agreement with him. The other officer in the room, a third-year patrolman named Gary Metz, who laughed at the right moments because it cost less not to, was nodding along with the expression of someone who has learned to treat other people's certainty as a substitute for their own. Hargrove was telling the story of the stop. He told it the way a man tells a story he has told many times before, with the practiced compression of someone who knows which details land and which can be safely omitted. He described the vehicle, the driver, the smell of marijuana, the discovery. He described his own actions in terms that positioned each one as a reluctant necessity rather than a choice. He used the word compliance the way some people use the word cooperation, as a gift being extended rather than a right being observed. And then, because the coffee was good, and the room was warm, and there was no one present who would push back, he said something he would later claim he had never said. He said that Cloverfield stayed manageable because the people there understood something that the courts had never been willing to say out loud, that order in a neighborhood like that didn't come from warrants and probable cause and four-step procedures. It came from certainty. It came from people knowing that there was someone on patrol who didn't need a reason, who needed a result. And that the distinction between the two in his 18 years on this beat had been the difference between a neighborhood you could walk through and a neighborhood you couldn't. Gary Metz laughed and said something non-committal. Hargrove refilled his coffee. Down the hall in the doorway of the break room, where neither of them had noticed him standing, Kevin Bryce listened to all of it. His face was unreadable. His hands were at his sides and completely still. The stillness of a man who is feeling something he doesn't yet have the words for, and who is trying very hard not to feel it in a place where feeling it would cost him something. He stood there for a long time, long enough to hear every word, long enough for the thing he was feeling to take on a shape. Then he went back to his desk and sat down and stared at his incident report form for 40 minutes without writing anything on it. In cell 2, Marcus sat on the metal bench with his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The other occupant of the cell, an older man heavy-set sleeping with his arm over his eyes, had not asked any questions. Marcus was grateful for this. He did not want to talk. He wanted to think. He thought about Jerome Shaw. He thought about what Loretta Shaw had said in the deposition he had read as part of the case file about coming to the precinct in her good coat about what Hargrove had said to her. He thought about Damon Rivers, 23 years old, currently in month 8 of 5 years at Bridgewater, who had been saving money for a culinary program application when Hargrove decided that his future was less important than a good clearance number for the month. He thought about the 24 men on the list, their names, their ages, what they had been doing before Hargrove decided they were a result rather than a person. He had memorized all of them, not because it was required, because they deserved to be memorized. At 2:15 in the morning, Marcus made his one phone call. He dialed a number he had been given to use only in the event that the operation was proceeding as intended. He said 4 words, a pre-arranged signal. The call lasted 8 seconds. Then he set the phone down, leaned his head back against the wall, and waited for morning. Arraignment came at 9:15. Bail set deliberately higher than Marcus could reasonably post without triggering questions. Charges filed formally possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance, illegal possession of a firearm, obstruction of a law enforcement officer. Marcus sat at the defense table for the first time and looked across at Frank Aldridge, the Harmon County Assistant District Attorney who had worked with Hargrove for 11 years, who had signed his name to every conviction, who had stood in front of juries in this building and presented Hargrove's testimony as truth because it was more convenient than asking whether it was. Aldridge was a trim man in his late 40s with a careful haircut and the kind of practiced confidence that reads in a courtroom as competence. He did not look at Marcus with contempt. He looked at him with the mild, efficient assessment of a man calculating how much work this particular case was going to require. Which was, he had already decided, not very much. Marcus looked at him for a long time. Then he wrote 2 words on the legal pad in front of him and turned the pad face down on the table. 8 months. That was how long this would take. He could wait. The pale November light came through the high windows of Courtroom 4B in long, flat slabs, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously overexposed and inadequate. Too bright in the wrong places. Not bright enough where it matters. The courtroom smelled of lemon floor wax and old wood, and the particular combination of anxiety and resignation that accumulates in public buildings where people regularly come to sit through things that will be decided without their input. The benches had been worn smooth by decades of people shifting their weight and trying to find a comfortable position in a room that was not designed for comfort. By 8:45 in the morning, the gallery was nearly full, not with journalists, not with advocates, with neighbors. People who had taken personal days from jobs at the hardware store and the school cafeteria and the dry cleaning shop 2 blocks from Denison Street. People who had arranged childcare and ridden the 7:15 bus and walked the last 4 blocks in the November cold because being here felt in a way they could not fully articulate like the only form of witness available to them. Loretta Shaw was in the 3rd row. Good coat buttoned to the collar. Cane placed precisely against the bench beside her. Hands folded in her lap. She had arrived at 8:15 and had not moved since. She had brought a small bottle of water in her coat pocket and a photograph of Jerome in his community college hoodie, which she had taken out once on the bus ride over and then put carefully back. She had never met the man at the defense table. She was not here for him. Not exactly. She was here because Frank Aldridge was prosecuting, and the charges were identical to the charges he had filed against Jerome, and she needed to sit in this room and see whether the performance was exactly the same. Because if it was exactly the same, then what she had always known in her body to be true would be true in a way that could no longer be argued with, even by the part of her that had spent 2 years hoping she was wrong. In the fourth row, a man named Ernest Tatum sat with his large hands flat on his knees and his jaw set at an angle that belonged to a man who has already decided something but is waiting to confirm it. He was 63 years old, retired from the Postal Service, working part-time at a hardware store on Cloverfield Avenue. He had a notepad in his breast pocket that he had brought because he thought he might want to write something down. He had not taken it out yet. He would not take it out at all. His grandson had been pulled over 3 times in the past 14 months by officers from the Cloverfield precinct. Each time, nothing. Each time his grandson had called him afterward, not his parents him, because Ernest was the one in the family who had been taught by his own grandfather to stay calm during those calls, and he had passed that teaching down, and it had worked 3 times, and Ernest was grateful. And he was also sitting in this courtroom on a Tuesday morning because gratitude had a limit, and he had reached it. In the back row, a young woman named Brianna Foster sat close to the aisle with her coat still on, as though she might need to leave quickly. She was 26. Her brother, Marcus Rivers, was in his 8th month at Bridgewater on a Hargrove arrest. Their mother had been the one to come to every hearing, every motion, every continuance. And last month their mother had had a small stroke and the doctor had said the stress needed to come down, and so it was Brianna here today instead, in her mother's place in the coat her mother had pressed that morning and handed to her at the door with both hands. Near the side window, the court reporter, a young woman named Angela Cole, no relation to the defendant, was setting up her equipment with the precise habitual movements of someone who has done this hundreds of times. She glanced at the defense table once and then looked away. Then looked back. The man sitting there was not exhibiting any of the behaviors she had come to associate across 4 years of court reporting, across hundreds of defendants with a person whose life was being actively dismantled. No fidgeting, no controlled blankness. No, the lawyer is handling it deference, just stillness, complete unperformative stillness. She thought he doesn't look like a man who is losing, and then she thought every visible measure says he is. And then she thought those 2 things cannot both be true. At the defense table, Diana Reeves opened her folders and arranged her tabs and wrote a note on her legal pad and crossed it out. She was a public defender. She was good at her job in the specific way that people are good at jobs they do in under-resourced conditions, which is to say she was resourceful and precise and genuinely invested, and she was also working 3 other cases simultaneously, and the evidence in this one was on the surface completely against her client. She had been told nothing about who Marcus actually was. She had prepared as well as anyone could prepare for a case with no physical evidence on her side, and she had come in this morning with a strategy that was honest and limited and unlikely to work. She leaned toward Marcus and said something quietly. He listened. He nodded. He did not look reassured. He looked like a man who already knew the shape of the morning and was simply waiting for it to begin. Dale Hargrove took the witness stand with the comfortable authority of a man settling into a chair he had occupied many times before. He was a large man, even larger without the rain and the darkness around him, and the witness chair seemed almost undersized for him, the way furniture sometimes seems undersized for people who have spent a long time believing that the space around them was theirs to fill. He placed his hands flat on his thighs. He looked at the jury. He nodded at Frank Aldridge in a way that communicated to anyone watching that these were 2 men who had done this particular dance before and who both knew the steps. Aldridge's direct examination was a performance in the truest sense, not theatrical but composed. rehearsed every question a step in a choreography designed to walk the jury from reasonable doubt to reasonable certainty, without them ever noticing the distance they had traveled. Hargrove answered in the voice of a man whose word had never once been successfully challenged in a court of law. He described the traffic stop with the specific confidence of someone who knows that his version of events is the only version that exists on paper. He said he had observed the defendant's vehicle exhibiting erratic lateral movement on Cloverfield Boulevard, a swerve. He said, though he said the word with the slight hesitation of a man who knows it will be recorded, and that he had initiated the stop for public safety reasons. From the defense table, Marcus listened. He noted internally without writing it down that Hargrove's first sentence contained a lie. He had driven that stretch of Cloverfield Boulevard in a perfectly straight line, and the button camera had recorded every inch of it. Hargrove described the encounter at the vehicle. He said Marcus had been immediately aggressive, had refused initially to lower his window, had reached toward the area beneath his seat in a manner Hargrove described with the practiced gravity of a man invoking the right terminology as threatening, had caused him to fear for his safety, had resulted in the recovery of both the controlled substance and the illegal firearm from exactly the area where the defendant had been reaching. Marcus counted 3 more lies in a single answer. Each one delivered with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had never felt the ground shift beneath a lie he had told. Then Aldridge asked whether the defendant had said anything during the encounter. Hargrove let a small, careful expression cross his face, not quite a smile, something more deliberate than a smile, and said that yes, the defendant had said, "You'll never make this stick, I run these streets." And he delivered the fabricated quote directly to the jury with the weight of 18 years of credibility behind it. From the defense table, Marcus felt the specific cold outrage of hearing words he had never spoken presented as fact to 12 people who had no reason to disbelieve them. He did not move. He did not write anything down. He simply registered the lie with the flat, precise attention of a man who is building an inventory. Diana Reeves stood for cross-examination and did what she could, which was not enough, and she knew it. She asked about the dash camera footage. Hargrove sighed with practiced regret and explained that due to the heavy rain and a server malfunction at the precinct, the footage had been corrupted beyond recovery. A shame, he said, because it would have shown exactly what happened. She asked about the body camera. The battery, he said with a slight shrug, had been dead since the previous shift he had filed the maintenance report. It was in the record. 2 jurors smiled at the small, self-deprecating note in his voice. Diana sat down. She had nothing. In the gallery, Kevin Bryce sat in his uniform with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw set at an angle that was not quite clenched, but was not relaxed either. He was not watching Hargrove on the stand. He was watching his own hands, which were perfectly still, in the way that hands are still when the person they belong to is working very hard to keep them that way. He was rehearsing something behind his eyes, something that was not the testimony he had agreed to give. In the 3rd row, Loretta Shaw listened to Hargrove describe the arrest of a man she had never met. She listened to the word order, the sequence, the specific language, and she felt the particular nausea of recognition, the physical sensation of hearing something you have heard before in this same room against someone you love. She had sat here 3 years ago and heard Hargrove use almost exactly the same words in almost exactly the same order to describe the arrest of her son. And she had believed sitting in that same chair that no one would ever be able to prove what she had always known in her body to be true. She did not move. She did not perform anything. She sat in her good coat with her hands folded and her cane beside her, and she watched Dale Hargrove step down from the witness stand with the easy confidence of a man who had just done something he was proud of. The recess came at 11:47. Judge Carol Dunmore stepped down from the bench with the brisk efficiency of a woman who ran her courtroom on a schedule, and the room exhaled collectively and rearranged itself. Lawyers shuffled papers. The bailiff stretched his neck. The court reporter uncapped a water bottle. The gallery shifted too, but more carefully the way people shift when they are in a space where being noticed costs something. Loretta Shaw did not move. She sat exactly as she had been sitting for the past 2 hours. Hands folded cane beside her and watched Dale Hargrove descend from the witness stand with the sure-footed ease of a man who had just done something he was proud of, and she felt in her chest the particular weight of a feeling she did not have a clean word for. Not grief, because grief had a softness to it. Not rage, because rage implied the energy to act. Something older than both. Something closer to the recognition of a pattern so deeply embedded in the way things worked that pointing to it had always felt like pointing at air. Jerome had been 27 when Hargrove arrested him. He had been working the night shift at the loading dock 4 days a week, $7.50 an hour, time and a half on weekends, saving for the spring semester tuition. He was 3 semesters in. Business administration. He had a plan that involved the degree and a management position at a distribution company where he'd done a summer internship, and where the regional manager had told him in writing that there was a place for him when he finished school. The drugs Hargrove had said he found were found under the driver's seat. The gun Hargrove had said he found was found in the same location. The language Hargrove had used in his report was precise, and she had read it so many times in the 14 months between Jerome's arrest and his sentencing that she could recite it from memory. She had asked the public defender whether the language was unusual. The public defender had said it was not. Jerome had been convicted in 9 days. She had come to the precinct after the conviction and before the sentencing in her good coat, and she had stood in the lobby and asked to speak with someone who could tell her what her son had actually done. And what Hargrove had said to her quietly without any particular emotion, the way you tell someone something you have said many times before and expect no response to, was that Cloverfield stayed manageable because the people there understood that he didn't need a reason. He needed a result. And that Jerome had given him one. She had never told anyone what he said. Not the public defender. Not her pastor. Not her sister. Not because she was afraid. Because she had learned over 58 years of living in a body that the world had decided it had the right to manage. That telling certain truths cost more than the telling was worth if no one with the power to act on them was listening. Tomorrow, she had planned to go home and call Patricia Alcott, Jerome's review attorney, and ask whether there had been any progress on the petition. She did this every Tuesday and every Friday. Patricia always answered with the same measured warmth. "We're working on it, Mrs. Shaw. These things take time. We haven't stopped." Loretta had been waiting for 2 years. She had not stopped either. She looked across the gallery at Kevin Bryce sitting in his uniform with his hands flat on his knees and his face turned slightly downward. She did not know his name. She had never seen him before today. But she noticed that he was not watching the proceedings the way an officer usually watched proceedings, with the professional detachment of someone who understood the machinery from the inside. He was watching them the way a man watches something he is trying to decide about. She thought he saw something. He knows something. She thought he is deciding whether it costs more to say it or not say it. She recognized the arithmetic. She had been doing it herself for 2 years. After the recess, Diana Reeves leaned close to Marcus and spoke quietly, her voice just below the ambient noise of the courtroom resettling itself into session. She said she had been thinking about a continuance. She said she could request additional time, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3, to track down a character witness or to search for anyone who might have been in the area of Cloverfield Boulevard on the night of November 14th. She said she knew it wasn't much, but it was something, and something was more than what they had right now, which was nothing. Marcus listened to everything she said. He listened with his full attention, the way a person listens when they genuinely respect the person speaking and want the speaker to know that the speaking was not wasted. And then he told her gently that he appreciated everything she had done and that the trial needed to continue and that he would be taking the stand. Diana looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus," she said, "he will tear you apart up there." Marcus looked across the room. Hargrove was at the prosecution table accepting a cup of coffee from a bailiff, laughing at something Frank Aldridge had just said. The ease of a man who has done this before and intends to do it again. "Let him try," Marcus said quietly. When Diana stood and announced that the defense called the defendant to testify, the gallery produced a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a murmur, somewhere between the two. the sound of a room recalibrating its expectations. Frank Aldridge looked up from his legal pad with an expression that moved through surprise and settled comfortably into something that looked very much like pleasure. A defendant who took the stand was a defendant who handed the prosecution a direct line to everything it needed to finish the job. He had seen this mistake made many times before. Hargrove, still seated in the gallery, leaned back in his chair with the particular quality of relaxation that belongs to a man who has seen this specific mistake made many times and who knows exactly what comes next. Marcus walked to the stand with the unhurried, deliberate pace he used for everything. Not slow enough to seem hesitant. Not fast enough to seem eager. He placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath in a voice that was clear and even, and entirely without performance. Just the flat declaration of a man saying the words because the words needed to be said. Diana's direct examination was brief. She asked Marcus whether he had committed the crimes he was charged with. He said no. She asked whether he had possessed the items recovered from his vehicle. He said no. She asked whether the traffic stop on Cloverfield Boulevard had proceeded as Sergeant Hargrove described it. Marcus said, no, it did not. Diana sat down. Frank Aldridge rose from the prosecution table with the controlled, purposeful energy of a man who has been waiting for something and is now permitted to begin. Aldridge's cross-examination was a precise and methodical thing. He was not flashy. He did not raise his voice. He asked questions the way a man drives a nail. Steady pressure, repeated application, confidence that the material will eventually give. He had been trying cases in this building for 16 years, and he had learned that juries respond better to authority projected than to authority demonstrated, and that a defendant on the stand under aggressive questioning will almost always give you something you can use as long as you are patient enough to wait for it. He asked Marcus to describe his occupation. Marcus said he was currently between positions. Aldridge asked where Marcus lived. Marcus gave an address on the east side of Harmon City. Aldridge asked why Marcus had been driving in the Cloverfield district at 11:30 at night. Marcus said he had been driving. Aldridge pressed driving. Where to what destination? With what purpose? Marcus said he had been conducting research. Aldridge paused a small, deliberate pause that he knew the jury would read as skepticism, and asked with the faintly incredulous tone of a man who has just heard something implausible. Research into what exactly? And Marcus looked at him steadily and said, into the question of whether Sergeant Hargrove needed a legal reason to stop a black man in this neighborhood, or just an opportunity. The courtroom went quiet. Not dramatically, not the way rooms go quiet in films with a musical cue and a reaction shot. Just quiet the way a room goes quiet when something true has been said in a space where truth is not always welcome. The kind of quiet that means everyone in the room has just recalibrated something, and no one is quite ready to say it yet. Aldridge recovered. He pivoted to the planted evidence with the efficiency of a man changing a subject he no longer controls. He asked Marcus to explain in his own words how a firearm and a controlled substance had ended up beneath the seat of his vehicle. Marcus said, "I can show you." Aldridge said he was asking for an explanation, not a demonstration. Marcus said, "The explanation requires the demonstration." Diana objected on grounds of confusion. Judge Dunmore, who had been watching Marcus with an expression that had subtly changed over the last several minutes from the standard attentiveness of a judge monitoring a routine cross-examination to something more focused and harder to name, overruled the objection. Marcus reached into the evidence pile at the defense table with Diana's assistance and the court's permission and produced a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, dated, time-stamped, forensically authenticated. They showed a .38 revolver in Sergeant Dale Hargrove's personal evidence locker at the Cloverfield precinct 6 weeks before the night of November 14th. The serial number filed off. A long diagonal scratch on the barrel running from grip to muzzle. He placed one photograph on the document viewer and another beside it. The evidence photograph from his own arrest, the same weapon photographed in the evidence bag, the same scratch visible in both images at the same angle, the same length, unmistakable. The courtroom shifted, not erupted. shifted the way a building shifts when something in the foundation moves before the structure above has registered what has happened. The sound was very small, just the collective intake of breath of people adjusting their understanding of what kind of morning this was turning into. Aldridge's composure, which had been the composure of a man who was confident in the outcome, developed a crack, small, barely visible, the first indication that the outcome was no longer what he had assumed. He demanded to know where the photographs had come from. He demanded to know how the defendant had obtained access to a police evidence locker. Marcus said he had not obtained access to the locker. The photographs had been taken by a federal forensic technician operating under a warrant issued by the United States District Court, Eastern District, in connection with an ongoing federal investigation. Aldridge said, "You are not a federal anything. You are a defendant from Cloverfield." He said it with the certainty of a man who believed it. Marcus looked at him steadily. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Slowly, with complete deliberateness, the way a person reaches for something when they want everyone in the room to see exactly what they are doing and understand exactly what it means. And he placed two things on the railing of the witness stand. First, the button from his lapel, small, ordinary-looking, unremarkable. Second, a badge, FBI Special Agent, Criminal Civil Rights Division. He placed them side by side without speaking. He let the room look at them for 3 full seconds. And in those 3 seconds, everything in Courtroom 4B, every understanding, every assumption, every version of the morning that anyone in the gallery had arrived with was quietly, irreversibly, and completely revised. 3 seconds is not a long time. It is not long enough to drink a glass of water, not long enough to read a paragraph, not long enough in most circumstances to change the way a room understands itself. But in the 38 years that Judge Carol Dunmore had spent inside courtrooms, first as a paralegal, then as a clerk, then as an attorney, then as a judge, she had learned that the specific quality of silence that falls after a revelation is not measured in seconds. It is measured in the distance between what was believed before and what is understood now. And the distance in this particular 3 seconds was the width of 18 years. Marcus said, "This device has been transmitting live 4K video and audio to a secure federal server since the night of November 14th. Everything that happened on Cloverfield Boulevard that night exists on federal record. The plant, the cuffs, the specific words spoken into my ear at the vehicle. All of it. Every frame." He said it without heat, without drama, in the flat, precise voice of a man delivering information that does not require performance because the information is sufficient on its own. In the gallery, the silence organized itself differently in different people. Loretta Shaw's hands unfolded in her lap. She did not do this consciously. Her hands simply opened fingers spreading slightly against the fabric of her good coat, and the movement was so small and so involuntary that the woman beside her did not notice it. But it happened, and it was the first movement Loretta Shaw had made in 2 hours, and it was the only response available to a woman who had spent 2 years pointing at air and who had just watched the air become solid. Ernest Tatum in the 4th row stood up. He did not do this because anyone asked him to. He did not do it for any strategic reason. He simply stood up from the bench slowly, the way a man stands when the only response available to him that feels proportionate to what he has just witnessed is to be vertical. He stood, and he looked at the witness stand, and he did not say anything. He just stood. Angela, the court reporter, stopped typing. She caught herself and resumed. But the pause was there. Small, unrecorded belonging only to her. The pause of a woman who has just understood the difference between a proceeding she was documenting and a moment she was witnessing. In the gallery, Dale Hargrove did not stand. He did not speak, but something happened in his body. A micro-shift in the shoulders, a tightening of the fingers on the bench in front of him. The almost imperceptible stiffening of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is not where he believed it was, and that this realization, once it arrives, cannot be unrealized. His platinum hair caught the fluorescent light above him and held it the way it always did, gleaming and unchanged. But everything else about the man in that gallery bench had changed in the last 3 seconds in a way that the fluorescent light could not reach. Frank Aldridge at the prosecution table had the expression of a man watching a building he owns fall down. Slowly, piece by piece, with nothing to do but watch. The rear doors of Courtroom 4B opened with a sound that was not loud but that carried through the room the way certain sounds carry when a room is very quiet, cleanly, completely leaving no part of the space untouched. A D. Sandra Okafor walked through them at the head of a 10-agent tactical team, all of them in body armor and tactical helmets, the yellow FBI letters on their windbreakers catching the fluorescent light. The whole group moving with the synchronized, purposeful efficiency of people who know exactly where they are going and have already decided everything about how they will conduct themselves when they get there. Okafor walked the center aisle of the courtroom the way water finds its level without effort, without deviation, arriving at the partition with the unhurried certainty of someone for whom this room was simply the final room in a long sequence of rooms she had been moving through for 6 months. She identified herself to Judge Dunmore. She identified Marcus' full name, rank operational designation, Operation Clean Ledger, 6 months in the field. Lead operative of a federal sting targeting evidence fabrication and civil rights violations within the Harmon City Police Department's Cloverfield precinct. She said it in a voice calibrated for the entire room to hear. The data from Agent Cole's field equipment has been transmitting continuously to federal servers since the night of November 14th. Okafor said, addressing the judge, but making sure the jury heard every word. The evidentiary record is complete and decryption is already underway at headquarters. Additionally, the operation has documented 31 cases in which Sergeant Hargrove's testimony served as the primary or sole basis for conviction. We have identified 24 defendants who remain incarcerated. Most of their sentences fall between 3 and 8 years. The name Operation Clean Ledger moved through the courtroom like a current. A name that meant the thing in this room had not begun this morning, had not begun with a badge placed on a railing, had begun 6 months ago in a monitoring room in Washington, D.C., with a woman reading a list of 24 names and deciding that those 24 names deserved more than a complaint filed and ignored. Dale Hargrove erupted. It was not a word, and it was not quite a shout. It was the sound of a man whose entire constructed self had just been demolished in public, a raw, guttural eruption that came from somewhere beneath a language, somewhere that 18 years of practiced authority had not managed to reach. And he was on his feet and moving before anyone had fully registered that he was moving not toward the bench, not toward Marcus, but toward Kevin Bryce. Toward the man he had built and controlled and believed he owned. Marcus was off the witness stand before the bailiffs took their second step. He moved the way people move who trained at Quantico, without wasted motion, without hesitation, without the half-second of deliberation that separates a civilian reaction from a professional one. He intercepted Hargrove in the gallery aisle, sweeping his leg and driving him to the courtroom carpet with a controlled, decisive force that shook the room and left Hargrove face down, arm torqued behind his back in a hold that applied precise and unambiguous pressure. "Sergeant Dale Hargrove," Marcus said, slightly correcting himself, his voice completely level even as his breathing worked to steady. Speaking directly into Hargrove's ear with the calm formality of a man who had rehearsed this moment not for drama, but for accuracy. "You are under arrest for perjury, fabrication of evidence, conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, and assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The two bailiffs arrived and looked at the screen still frozen on Hargrove's hand holding the planted revolver, the scratch on the barrel visible and unambiguous, and then looked at Kevin Bryce in the gallery sitting with his face in his hands, then back at Hargrove on the floor. One of them, after a long moment, said quietly, "Stand down. He's got him." While the agents processed Hargrove, a sound came from the prosecution table that was quiet enough that it might have gone unnoticed in a room with any ambient noise at all. But the room had no ambient noise. It was the hurried, papery sound of a man trying to make evidence disappear, the scrabbling of Frank Aldridge's hands moving through his open briefcase with the frantic purposefulness of someone who has suddenly remembered that everything he has ever done is written down somewhere. His back was partly turned to the room. His phone was in his hand. The screen lit his thumb, moving with the desperate speed of a man deleting emails, clearing message threads, trying to sever the digital connective tissue between himself and a corruption enterprise that had been running for 11 years through the venue of his own professional authority. "Mr. Aldridge," Marcus said. Aldridge stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his back to the room for a moment that seemed to last much longer than it actually did, and then he turned slowly. And the face that had been laughing with Hargrove an hour ago, the face that had been checking its watch with the casual confidence of a man who owns the outcome, was now the face of someone who has understood very suddenly and very completely that the outcome is not his. He said, "I can explain the arrangement. There were pressures. You have to understand the pressures in this office. Carter Hargrove had leverage over me. I was operating under coercion, under a kind of duress that doesn't have a clean legal name, but that—" "Mr. Aldridge," Marcus said, "prosecutorial immunity covers errors of judgment within the scope of legal practice. It does not cover accepting payment to imprison innocent people. Those are not the same category of thing, and you have always known that." The agent who stepped in behind Aldridge was matter-of-fact about it. No drama. Simply the procedural click of federal restraints engaging, and Aldridge made a sound that was high and broken and genuinely pathetic. The sound of a man who has spent 11 years building a professional identity around a particular kind of courage and has just discovered that the courage was borrowed and the lender has called the loan. The jurors, watching him be led from the room, did not look away. After the agents had moved Hargrove and Aldridge through the side door, and the room had settled into the stunned, weighted quiet of a space where something irreversible had just happened, Judge Carol Dunmore sat back in her chair and looked at the projector screen, still frozen on Hargrove's hand, holding the planted revolver, the scratch on the barrel visible and unambiguous. She looked at it for a long time. She had been a judge for 22 years. She could not remember the last time she had sat in this chair and not known what to do next. "Agent Cole," she said. Her voice had come down from its judicial register to something more fundamental, the voice of a woman, not a title, asking a question she needed the answer to. "How long has this been happening in my courtroom?" Marcus was still standing near the center of the room, not at the witness stand, not at the defense table. Simply standing in the open space that felt in that moment like where a person should stand when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "At least 31 cases where Sergeant Hargrove's testimony was the primary or sole evidence, Your Honor," he said. "We've identified 24 defendants who are still incarcerated. Most of their sentences are between 3 and 8 years. Judge Dunmore looked at her own hands resting on the edge of the bench. She looked at them the way you look at something familiar that has suddenly revealed a quality you did not know it had. And then she looked up and her gaze traveled across the room and found Loretta Shaw in the third row. Loretta had not moved. She was sitting exactly as she had been sitting all morning, upright hands now open in her lap, cane beside her. When the judge's eyes found hers, she did not look away. She did not perform anything. She simply sat there in her good coat, the coat she wore to court, because she believed the proceedings deserved respect even when the proceedings had not earned it, and she held the judge's gaze with the steady, patient, exhausted dignity of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years without any particular reason to believe it would come. Something moved through Judge Dunmore's face that was not a single expressible emotion, but was the combined weight of 22 years of sentences delivered, 22 years of reports, signed 22 years of a presumption that had cost people she had never looked at directly everything they had. She turned to her clerk. "Jenny," she said, "I am declaring a mistrial in the matter of State versus Cole effective immediately. I want every order signed in this courtroom today vacated before end of business. And I want you to begin preparing an order for the immediate review of every case in which Sergeant Dale Hargrove provided sworn testimony as the primary or sole evidentiary basis for conviction. Every case, going back to the beginning of his time in the Cloverfield precinct." "Yes, Judge," Jenny said and began typing. The procession out of a courtroom 4B moved the way all irreversible things move without the theatrical orchestration that the movies had led people to expect from moments like this. Just the flat documentary fact of men in federal restraints being walked through a room by people whose job it was to walk them. The sound of footsteps on old carpet. Unremarkable. The ceiling lights as indifferent as they had always been. Hargrove went first. He was boxed by 4 agents, and his head was not held high, not by anyone's hand, not by any external force, simply because whatever internal structure had been holding it there for 18 years had been removed. The platinum hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him look for the first time not like an authority figure, but simply like a large man who had made catastrophic choices and was only now beginning to understand their weight. He moved through the center aisle with the involuntary shuffle of a man whose body had not yet fully processed what his mind was beginning to understand. As he passed the jury box, juror. Number 7, a man named Ernest Tatum, 63 years old, retired, who had lived in the Cloverfield district his entire life, and whose grandson had been pulled over 3 times in the last year by officers from the same precinct, stood up from his seat without being asked. Simply stood because standing was the only response available to him that felt proportionate to what he had just witnessed. He looked at Hargrove and said, "I know what you took." He did not specify. He did not need to. Hargrove did not look at him. As the procession passed the 3rd row, Hargrove's path brought him within 4 feet of Loretta Shaw. She did not surge forward, did not shout, did not reach for him in any way. She simply said her son's name once clearly in the voice you use when you want a word to be impossible to ignore. Jerome. Hargrove flinched. It was small and involuntary. A single tremor that moved through his jaw, and then he was past her and moving toward the door. But he had flinched, and Loretta had seen it. And she sat back against the bench and closed her eyes for a moment, and the expression on her face was not triumph and was not relief, but was something quieter and more permanent than either the specific piece of a thing that has finally been acknowledged after a very long time of being denied. Aldridge followed. His exit was different in character, louder, more undone. The expensive suit rumpled his voice, cycling between asking for his lawyer and repeating the word "wait" to no one in particular, as though the proceedings might still be paused and revised if he found the right person to direct the word toward. Outside the courthouse 40 minutes later, Loretta Shaw stood at the top of the stone steps in the thin November sunlight. The cold air settled against her face. She did not move for a long moment, just stood, letting the day arrive around her. Then she reached into her coat pocket, found her phone, and dialed a number. Patricia Alcott answered on the 2nd ring. She was Jerome's review attorney. A young woman who had been working Jerome's petition for 11 days without stopping, who answered calls at any hour, who had never once said the words, "I don't think this is going anywhere," because she had never believed them. Loretta said, "I just left the courthouse. Hargrove is done. I need to know where we are." Patricia's voice came back measured and warm. She began explaining. The review petition, the status of the evidence, the timeline for a formal hearing, the steps between now and the step that mattered most. And the longer Loretta listened, the more still she became. And when the call ended, she stood with the phone in her hand and looked at the courthouse steps beneath her feet, where a few dry autumn leaves were drifting across the stone in small, aimless arcs, and she thought about Jerome in his cell at Bridgewater. She thought about the Thursday evening phone calls. She thought about what it cost a person to build a life and then have it taken and then have to find out whether the pieces were still recoverable. She said one word quietly to no one, and to Jerome, and to the November air. Soon. Word moved through the main hallway of the courthouse the way it always moves through institutional buildings, not through official announcements, not through the deliberate dissemination of information, but through clerks who had heard the bailiff say something, and defense attorneys waiting on benches for their own matters, who had seen the FBI team enter the building and done the math, and the woman at the information desk who had watched Hargrove being walked through the lobby in federal restraints and had immediately picked up her phone and dialed her husband, who drove a route that passed through Cloverfield every morning. Within 20 minutes of the agents walking Hargrove through the side door, the hallway held a loose, uncertain gathering of people who had arranged themselves along the walls with the instinctive choreography of those who know that something significant is passing through and who are not sure whether to wait or whether they are witnesses or participants. Kevin Bryce was at the far end of the hallway near the water fountain, not trying to leave and not trying to disappear. He was still in his uniform. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at the wall across from him with the specific studied blankness of a man who is not actually looking at anything, but is using the act of looking to avoid the act of deciding. He had made his decision in the courtroom when the audio recording played and his own voice came out of the speakers and the oscillating line on the monitor went flat, and Judge Dunmore asked whether that was his voice. And he had looked at Hargrove drawing a finger across his throat in open court, and then looked at Marcus on the witness stand, giving him a single slow nod, and he had thought, "This is the moment. This is the moment I either do the thing I should have done 11 months ago, or I live inside not doing it for the rest of my life." He had said, "Yes, Your Honor. Everything on that recording is true." Now he was standing by the water fountain trying to understand what came next. Marcus approached him without urgency, the same deliberate, unhurried walk he had used for everything in the past 8 months of this operation, the walk of a man who was not performing patience, but who was patient. He stood beside Bryce and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "What you did in there took more than what you've been given credit for having." Bryce didn't answer immediately. He turned the hat over in his hands. Then he said in a voice stripped of every professional register it normally carried, the voice of a young man who had not slept well in 3 months, "I knew. I knew from the first night. I watched him do it and I looked at the ground." Marcus said, "I know." Bryce said, "That doesn't make it." Marcus said, "No, it doesn't." A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 men standing in a hallway after something large has ended, who are both in the process of figuring out what the large thing means. Marcus said, "The neighborhood you've been patrolling for the past year has been living inside what you saw that night for 18 years, without the option of looking at the ground, without the option of walking away afterward." Bryce looked at him. He was young enough that his face still showed what he was feeling, and what he was feeling was the specific clarifying weight of being made to understand something you already knew in a way that made it impossible to unknow it. Brianna Foster had stopped a few feet away. She was on her phone, but she had slowed her pace and she was listening. She looked at Bryce, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the direct, measuring gaze of a young woman who has spent 8 months watching her brother's case go nowhere, and who is now in the process of deciding whether the man in front of her is someone who is at a threshold or someone who is simply standing near one. She did not speak. She moved on, but she had looked at him. Bryce would go on to provide written testimony. He would do it not because he was required to, not because it protected him in any legal sense, but because he had been standing in the doorway of a break room 11 months ago and had heard Dale Hargrove say exactly what he believed, and had said nothing, and had carried that silence like a stone in his chest ever since. He put on his hat. He looked at Marcus. He said, "Is there someone I should call?" Marcus gave him a name and a number. He said, "Do it today." Bryce nodded. He walked out through the front doors of the courthouse into the November afternoon, and for the first time in 11 months, the stone was not in his chest. The secured bay behind the courthouse smelled of exhaust and cold concrete, and the flat mineral smell of a space that sees no weather underground industrial indifferent to the kind of morning the city above it was having. The federal transport vehicle was a reinforced van parked against the back wall, its engine running, 2 agents standing at the rear with the easy practice stance of people doing a job they have done before. Hargrove was already in federal restraints, heavy, unyielding cuffs, a different category of thing entirely from the department-issue cuffs he had used on dozens of people in this city over 18 years. The restraints were connected by a short chain. His medals were skewed on his chest from the takedown. He was standing at the open rear door of the van, being processed by an agent who was working with the quiet, mechanical efficiency of a person handling something that has been decided. Marcus walked into the bay from the side entrance. He stood at the open door and looked at Hargrove. Not with contempt, not with the satisfaction of a completed thing, with the level, considered expression of a man who has something to say and has been waiting for the right moment to say it and who now has it. Hargrove looked at him across the small acoustic space of the van's open door. The platinum hair fallen, the barrel chest less certain than it had been 6 hours ago. For the first time since Marcus had watched him walk toward the Impala on Cloverfield Boulevard 11 months ago, he looked simply like a man, Large-aged, very tired in the specific way that men are tired when the weight of what they have done finally arrives without the insulation of authority to absorb it. Hargrove said, "Why? You could have shown the badge that first night. You could have stopped all of this at the car." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly in a voice calibrated for Hargrove alone, the two of them in the acoustic pocket created by the van's open door and the concrete walls on either side, "If I had shown you my badge that night, you would have let me go. You would have apologized. You might have even meant it. And then the next night you would have done the same thing to someone who didn't have a badge, who didn't have a wire, who didn't have any way out at all." He paused. Then, "I didn't do this to save myself, Dale. I did it to catch you being you. I needed the world to see the man, not just the uniform, because the uniform was protecting the man, and the man was destroying people." Hargrove stared at him. His mouth opened and closed once. Nothing came out. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, cheap plastic cigarette lighter. White. The kind that costs less than $1 and gets lost in the cushions of couches. He held it up between two fingers, this small, ordinary, completely unremarkable thing. "You dropped this at the car," Marcus said, "the night you planted the gun. Evidence log returned it to me last week." He set the lighter carefully into Hargrove's cuffed hands. "Keep it," Marcus said. "It's the only light you're going to see for a long time." He stepped back from the door. He nodded to the marshal. The door swung closed with a sound that was heavy and final and entirely devoid of drama. Just metal meeting metal. Just one chapter ending. Just a door. Marcus stood in the empty bay for a long moment after the van pulled out. The concrete walls, the fluorescent lights. The sound of the city muffled above him, ordinary and complicated, going about its morning without any particular awareness of what had been accomplished in the rooms above this bay over the past several hours. He thought about what a badge actually was. Not the metal disc, not the number on it, but what it represented, the provisional trust that a community extends to an individual, the authority lent rather than owned, the obligation taken on rather than the power seized. The moment a person in uniform begins to treat that trust as personal property rather than public service, something begins to die. Not loudly, not all at once, but gradually in the quiet spaces between official records, in the gap between what is documented and what actually happened, in the specific weight of knowledge carried by a 58-year-old woman in a good coat who had been pointing at that gap for 2 years and watching it be called invisible. The law is not a shield until someone chooses to carry it like one. Every day, in every encounter, even when, especially when carrying it, cost something. He walked back toward the courthouse entrance. There was work to do. 8 months is not a long time in the scale of things. It is not long enough for a neighborhood to forget. It is not long enough for 24 men to stop being in cells they should not be in. It is barely long enough for the institutional machinery of a federal prosecution to work through its procedural requirements and arrive at the moment where a judge reads numbers from a sheet and a man's life changes in the way that only numbers read in a particular room by a particular authority can change a life. The federal courthouse on a Tuesday in late July held the same pale light it had held in November, but warmer now, and the smell was different, the lemon floor wax, the same, but underneath it something almost like summer leaking in through the high windows. Dale Hargrove at the federal defense table. 8 months in administrative detention had done what 8 months in administrative detention does to a man who has spent 18 years being the largest thing in every room he entered. He was smaller now, not in frame. The frame was the same, but in the quality of presence that had once arrived before him, and now seemed to lag behind. The platinum hair had grown out unevenly. His court-appointed attorney, a young man doing the best he could with very little, had arranged the files on the table in careful order, which was the only order available to him because, in terms of the case itself, there was no order at all. The victim's impact statements were heard first. Damon Rivers spoke from a lectern placed before the bench, 24 years old now, released 6 weeks earlier after his conviction was overturned on the basis of the federal forensic evidence linking the planted revolver to Hargrove's tactical vest. He was wearing a gray shirt and dark slacks, clothes that fit correctly in the way that his previous clothes no longer had upon release. He spoke briefly and without theatrics. He said what Hargrove took from him in order his job at the catering company where he had been a line cook for 3 years and where they had agreed to hold his position for 2 weeks after his arrest before filling it. His apartment, the lease terminated in month 4 of his sentence. 8 months of his daughter Camille's first year of life, which he had experienced through a photograph his mother had printed and mailed to him, and which he had kept folded in the spine of a book for 8 months, because the photograph was the only place Camille existed for him during that time. He said he was not asking the court for anything on his behalf. He was asking the court to make certain through the sentence it imposed that the next 24-year-old who drove through Cloverfield on a Tuesday night with his registration current and his taillights functional had a reason to believe that the uniform watching him from the patrol car was carrying a trust rather than a weapon. He folded his notes, nodded at the judge, and returned to his seat. 2 other survivors spoke brief specific without performance. The courtroom listened. Then Loretta Shaw came to the lectern. She stood there for a moment before speaking in her good coat. She had worn it again today because she believed the proceedings deserved respect even when the proceedings had not earned it. And today the proceedings had, and she placed both hands flat on the lectern and looked at the room. She said that she was going to be specific because specificity was what the occasion required, and because she had learned that when you speak in general terms about what has been done to someone you love, the someone you love disappears into the generality, and she refused to let that happen. She said Jerome's age when Hargrove arrested him. She said what he was studying. She said the warehouse job and the tuition payments and the way he called her every Thursday after his late shift without fail. Every Thursday 8 months before Hargrove ended that too. She said what Hargrove had told her when she came to the precinct to beg in her good coat with her hands shaking. She said that she forgave Dale Hargrove. She said it in a way that made absolutely clear in the quality of the silence that preceded the word and the particular weight she gave to the syllables that her forgiveness was a private transaction between herself and her own conscience arrived at through her own faith in her own time, and that it had nothing whatsoever to do with what this room was about to do to him. That the 2 things existed in entirely separate categories, and that confusing them would be a disservice to both. When she walked back to her seat, she passed the federal prosecution table. Marcus reached out and briefly took her hand. Her hand was cold. Her grip was the grip of someone who has been holding on for a very long time and who has only just been given permission to let go. Hargrove was given the opportunity to speak. He took it, which was in the end entirely consistent with everything he had always been, a man who could not resist one more chance to explain himself, one more opportunity to position his choices as necessities rather than decisions. He said the courts had been too soft. He said the streets required certainties that the law was unwilling to provide. He said someone had to hold the line and that holding it had costs, and that the people in this room in their suits and their procedures did not understand what it cost to keep a neighborhood like Cloverfield from consuming itself. Marcus stood. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You weren't holding the line, Dale. You were the line, the one that people on your side of a badge thought they'd never have to cross to get to you. Every person you put away, every case you manufactured, every morning you clocked in and decided that those people's futures were yours to allocate, you were the line. Not the one keeping order, the one making disorder invisible, so the system could pretend it wasn't there." He paused. Then, "That's done now." The sentence was 22 years federal. No parole eligibility. Hargrove's legs gave out under the weight of the arithmetic, and the marshals held him up, and he made a sound that was not a word, and the room was very quiet around it. They moved him towards the transport door. The chain at his ankles made its small, rhythmic sound against the floor. When he looked back over his shoulder at Marcus, a last wild, searching look. The look of a man trying to find a surface he can still grab onto in a room that has become entirely water. Marcus looked back at him steadily, without heat, without satisfaction, without anything other than the level considered regard of a man who has finished a job. Aldridge received 14 years, a permanent disbarment and restitution ordered to every wrongfully convicted defendant whose case had passed through his office. He was led out without speaking. The room did not cheer. There was no celebration. Loretta Shaw closed her eyes and sat very still for a long moment, the way a person sits when they have been carrying something for a very long time and the release of it feels not like relief, but like learning to use a set of muscles they had forgotten they had. The federal case review took 6 months. It was conducted by a joint task force, federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and an independent oversight body appointed by the district court, and when it was complete, its findings ran to 412 pages that most people would never read. But what those pages contained underneath the procedural language and the case numbers and the evidentiary annotations was not a document about a corrupt sergeant in a mid-sized city. It was a portrait of what happens when an institution mistakes the absence of accountability for the presence of order. There were 31 cases. 24 defendants still incarcerated when the task force began its work. Each of the 24 was a person, not a statistic, not a data point. A person with a name and an age and a specific set of things they had been doing before Dale Hargrove decided their futures were available for redistribution. Marcus had memorized all 24 before he drove his first night on Cloverfield Boulevard. He had memorized them because they deserved to be memorized because the distance between an investigation that treats human beings as abstractions and an investigation that treats them as people with Thursday phone calls and business degrees and catering jobs is the difference between justice as procedure and justice as obligation. Jerome Shaw walked out of Bridgewater Correctional on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he had been arrested. This was not planned. It was simply the day the release order was processed, but Loretta noticed it standing at the gate in her good coat with Jerome's photograph still in her pocket because she had forgotten to take it out. She thought Tuesday taken Tuesday returned, as if the calendar owed him something and had finally paid. Jerome came through the gate in the clothes he had come in. They no longer fit across the shoulders, carrying a small plastic bag of his personal effects. He looked older. Not tired in a broken way, but older in the way that people are older when they have spent 2 years containing themselves inside a space that was not designed for them and have somehow come through it still intact. Loretta was at the gate. They did not speak for a long time. They stood together in the cold morning air, and that was enough, that specific sufficiency of 2 people standing close to each other after a very long time apart, where the standing itself is the complete expression of everything that needs to be said. Eventually, Jerome said something small and ordinary about the drive. Loretta said something about the food she had prepared, and they got in the car and she drove and he sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked despite the cold, watching the city come back to him in sections, the highway. First, then the surface streets, then the familiar geometry of the neighborhoods he knew, returning to him 1 block at a time. She told him about the trial, about the van door, about Marcus placing the badge on the railing. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Did she come?" The woman from the 3rd row. Loretta looked at him. "That was me," she said. A pause. Then, "I know," Jerome said. "I know it was." His first Thursday home, he was in Loretta's kitchen, the smell of everything she had planned for 2 years, arriving in stages as she cooked, and he called Patricia Alcott, Jerome's review attorney, to thank her. The call was brief and professional and warm. When it ended, Jerome sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window, and outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing what late afternoon light does in October, going golden and low, and making ordinary things look briefly extraordinary. He thought about what came next, not with dread and not with resentment, with the specific deliberate orientation of a man who has had 2 years to understand that the worst thing that can happen to you if you let it is to let what was done to you become the definition of what you are. Jerome Shaw was 29 years old. He had a business degree to finish. He had a plan that a regional manager had put in writing. He had a mother who wore her good coat to every proceeding because she believed the proceedings deserved respect even when they hadn't earned it. He had work to do. The Shaw Rivers Accountability Standards, named for Jerome Shaw and Damon Rivers in the task force's final report, were adopted by the Harmon City Police Department by court order effective 90 days after the sentencing. They mandated continuous body camera operation for all field officers, independent forensic verification for evidence recovered during traffic stops, and a mandatory external review process for any case in which a single officer's testimony constituted the primary evidentiary basis for conviction. Within 18 months, 7 other municipalities had adopted versions of the standards. Not because of political pressure. Not because of protests or advocacy campaigns, though those mattered, but because a federal judge had ordered it, and because a federal agent had spent 11 nights in the rain building an evidentiary foundation so thorough, so documented, and so legally irreversible that the order could not be appealed. 3 additional officers from the Cloverfield precinct faced federal charges. The entire senior officer corps was reviewed. The precinct was restructured under a new commander appointed by the oversight body. Kevin Bryce left the department 6 weeks after the trial. He was working construction now, a job on the south side of the city foundation pours, and framing the kind of work that required precision and delivered results you could stand next to and measure with your hands. Concrete in his forearms at the end of the day. The honest, uncomplicated geometry of a floor that would hold whatever was built on top of it without asking for recognition. He had been asked a few times in the month since he left the department whether he missed the job. He thought about it carefully each time because it was a serious question that deserved a serious answer. And what he concluded was that what he missed was the version of the job he had believed he was joining, the version where the badge meant something. It turned out the badge did not universally mean, and that version had never quite existed the way he thought it did. Not everywhere, not without cost. Building things that did not require him to decide who deserved protection was right now the only work he trusted himself to do. The court reporter, Angela, wrote in a personal essay that she submitted to a legal journal 4 months after the trial, and that was rejected, and then accepted, and then read by 12,000 people. I have been a court reporter for 4 years, and I have sat in rooms where justice happened and rooms where it did not, and the difference between the two is not always apparent while you are sitting in them. What I know now that I did not know before the morning of November 22nd in Courtroom 4B is that justice is not a feeling. It is a structure. Someone built it. Someone chose to build it even when the building cost them something, and the cost is what makes it real. Ernest Tatum went home that evening and called his grandson. He told him about the day, about standing up without being asked, about the sound in the room when the badge was placed on the railing. And then he told his grandson something he had been told by his own grandfather 40 years ago and had kept and used and passed forward, and he said, "Your dignity is not theirs to give, and it is not theirs to take. They can do a lot of things to you. They cannot do that." His grandson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, Grandpa." Ernest said, "I know you know. I just wanted you to hear it from me today." 6 weeks after the sentencing, on a Saturday morning in early September, Damon Rivers walked into a community center on the east side of Harmon City and found a seat near the window in a room that smelled of fresh paint and old carpet and the specific brand of institutional coffee that community centers have served since the beginning of community centers. The job readiness workshop was a parole condition. He would have attended anyway. This was not the attitude he had arrived with 6 weeks ago when his release papers were processed and he had walked out of Bridgewater into a September morning that was warm in a way he had forgotten mornings could be warm. The kind of warmth that exists only after you have been deprived of it long enough to feel it land on you like a specific thing rather than a general condition. That morning he had been angry. Not in a theatrical way, in the deep, calibrated way that anger settles into a person who has spent 8 months doing the math on what was taken from him and arriving each time at the same number. His job gone. The catering company had been very apologetic when he called and had offered him a reference which was the least they could do, and which Damon had accepted with the polite efficiency of a man who has no interest in prolonging a conversation about something he cannot change. His apartment gone. His fiancée, Renee, had moved on. She had called him in month 4 to tell him, and the call had been painful and honest and without villains, which was in some ways worse than if there had been a villain because anger is a cleaner thing to carry than grief. 8 months of Camille's first year, a set of photographs his mother had printed and mailed to him every 3 weeks, which he had kept folded in the spine of a book until he had enough of them to arrange in order on his bunk and look at each morning as something approaching a continuous record. He had his daughter now. Camille, 14 months old, who regarded him with the neutral open curiosity of an infant who did not yet understand that the man holding her was her father, but who recognized through whatever mechanism infants use to recognize things that the quality of his attention was particular. He was staying with his mother, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, working 2 days a week at a restaurant near the waterfront that had been willing to give him a trial period, which he was treating with the precision of a man who understood that a trial period was not a gift, but a test. He had a plan. The plan involved the culinary program he had been saving for before Hargrove decided that his future was available for reassignment. The program was still running. He had requested the application materials. The workshop was led by a woman named Gail, who had the specific combination of warmth and directness that belongs to people who have been doing this work for a long time and who have no patience for either condescension or false optimism. She went through resume formats and interview protocols and the specific language of explaining a gap in employment history in terms that were honest without being self-defeating. During the break, a paralegal volunteer named Trevor was talking with a small group near the window about current legal developments in Harmon City. He mentioned in passing the Shaw Rivers accountability standards named for 2 of the men whose wrongful convictions had been overturned in the federal review. He said that were now being implemented by the department and were being looked at by other cities. Damon was not in this group. He was standing by the coffee urn waiting for it to finish cycling. But he heard the name. He set his cup down. He said to Trevor, "What was the other name?" Trevor said Shaw, Jerome Shaw, released about 6 weeks ago, and Damon Rivers, he was one of the first ones overturned. Damon looked at him for a moment. He said, "That's me." Trevor looked at him. Then he said the name of the standard again, Shaw Rivers, and something in the way he said it made it sound like what it was, a name given to a law, to a set of requirements that would outlast both of the people who bore it, that would protect people whose names neither of them would ever know. Damon asked Trevor to write down the exact name. Trevor wrote it on a card. Damon folded the card carefully and put it in his wallet in the back compartment behind his library card. He did not know what to do with it yet. He knew it was important. He knew that having his name on a law, not his face, not his story, just his name, was a form of permanence that nothing that had been done to him could erase. And he knew that the appropriate response to permanence was not to look at it too directly or too often, but to put it somewhere safe and let it do what permanent things do. He sat back down and finished the workshop. When it ended, he walked out into the September afternoon and called his mother to say he was on his way and that he would pick up groceries on the way home. His mother said she was making something. He said he knew. She said it was nothing special. He said he knew that too. He walked to the bus stop in the September warmth and stood there waiting in the specific ordinary way that people stand at bus stops, slightly forward on their feet, aware of the general direction from which the bus would come, and he was Damon Rivers, 24 years old. Line cook, father of a 14-month-old named Camille. Person whose name was now part of a law, standing in the sun waiting for the bus. 1 week after the sentencing, Marcus drove through Cloverfield in the early evening as the street lamps came on. The Chevy Impala was still unremarkable, still beat up in the right places, still exactly the right car for a man who needed to be invisible in the places where the invisible people lived and who understood now, as he understood it then, that invisibility in Cloverfield was not a strategy. It was a condition that the neighborhood's residents had been assigned rather than chosen, and that the ethical weight of using it as a tool was something he had never stopped carrying through the 6 months of the operation. He drove past the corner of Cloverfield and Denison, where he had pulled to the curb 11 months ago. Past the old textile building with the broken sign where Hargrove had pressed him against the hood of the Impala in the rain, the specific stretch of wet concrete and orange lamplight that had been the stage for the beginning of the end of 18 years. He did not slow down. He did not pause. He did not give the location any more weight than it deserved now that it was behind him. Some locations hold weight only as long as what happened in them remains unresolved. This one had been resolved. It was a corner now. Just a corner. At a red light 6 blocks north, he reached up and unclipped the button from his jacket lapel. He held it in his palm for a moment. This small, ordinary-looking thing. The thing that had carried so much, not just the video, not just the audio, not just the evidentiary record that had built a federal prosecution, but the specific, unbroken thread of truth that had run from his chest to a server in Washington, while a man told him where he was going and how long he would be there. The thing that had made the invisible visible. The thing that in the end was just a button that was not a button held in the palm of a man who had been willing to be a defendant for 8 months so that 24 other men could stop being convicts. He set it carefully on the passenger seat. The light turned green. He drove. The city moved around him the way it always had. Ordinary and complicated, loud in its sounds and quiet in its meanings, full of people going about Tuesday evenings in September, without any particular awareness of what had been done on their behalf over the past year, which was exactly as it should be, because the work was never supposed to be about awareness. It was supposed to be about safety. And safety when it worked was invisible, not in the way that harm was invisible, concealed, and denied, but in the way that a solid floor is invisible, you don't notice it, because it holds you without asking you to notice. He thought about the 24 men. Most of them were out now, or in the process of being released. The task force working through the cases in order, the review hearings scheduled, the paperwork moving through the system at the measured pace of paperwork that cannot be rushed, because the people waiting for it have already waited long enough and deserve to have it done correctly rather than quickly. He thought about Jerome Shaw in his mother's kitchen on Denison Street, thinking about what comes next. He thought about Damon Rivers standing at a bus stop somewhere on the east side of the city, carrying a folded card in his wallet with his own name on it. He thought about the Shaw-Rivers standards not as a victory, not as a monument, but as a working document. A set of requirements. The kind of thing that does its job without announcing itself, that protects people who will never know it's protecting them, that makes a particular kind of morning slightly safer for a man driving home from work at 11:30 at night with his registration current and his taillights on. He thought about what a badge actually was. Not the medal, not the authority it symbolized, but the obligation it encoded, the provisional trust extended by a community to an individual requiring constant re-earning belonging to the community rather than to the person carrying it. The moment it becomes personal property rather than public trust, it begins to corrode everything it touches, not dramatically, not with a single visible failure, but gradually in the gap between what is documented and what actually happened, in the space between the official record and the truth that a woman in a good coat carries in her body because no one with the power to write it down has ever been willing to. The law is not a shield until someone decides to carry it like one. Every day, in every stop, in every encounter where the easiest thing would be to look at the ground. Marcus pulled up in front of his apartment building. He sat in the car for a moment. He picked up the button from the passenger seat and put it in his jacket pocket. He would turn it into the evidence room tomorrow. It had done what it was made to do. There was a next case. There was always a next case. The gate at Bridgewater Correctional opened at 8:15 in the morning. Loretta Shaw had been in the parking lot since 7:40. She had driven the 300 miles the day before, staying at a motel off the highway that cost $62, and she had not slept well. But she had not expected to sleep well, and she had not minded, because lying awake in a $62 motel room 3 miles from where her son was sleeping was infinitely preferable to lying awake in her own bed on Denison Street, which she had been doing every night for 2 years. She had Jerome's photograph in her coat pocket. She had brought it because she needed something of him to hold during the wait. She forgot to take it out before he came through the gate. He came through at 8:22. The clothes from intake no longer fit across the shoulders. He was thinner in the face. Older in the way that is not about lines, but about the quality of attention in a person's eyes, the look of someone who has spent 2 years being very careful about what they allowed themselves to notice, and who is now very slowly allowing the field of attention to expand again. He was carrying a small plastic bag of personal effects. Inside, a phone with a dead battery, a wallet with $9 in it, a book of crossword puzzles, 3/4 finished, and a folded photograph of Loretta at the community center Christmas party 4 years ago, which he had kept on the shelf above his bunk, and which had served as the primary proof on the hardest mornings that there was a shelf above a different kind of bunk waiting for him. Loretta was at the gate. They stood together in the cold morning air for a long time and said nothing. Jerome set down the plastic bag. Loretta did not reach for him immediately. She waited until he was ready, until he had taken a breath and looked at the sky for a moment, and then looked at her. Then she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the parking lot of Bridgewater Correctional in the October cold, while a corrections officer held the gate and looked at the middle distance with the tactful blankness of a person allowing a private moment to be private. Eventually, Jerome said something small about the drive. Loretta said she had left at 6. Jerome said that was too early. Loretta said she had stopped for coffee. Jerome said he was glad. They got in the car. On the highway, he sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked despite the cold. Loretta had asked twice whether he wanted it up, and twice he had said no, watching the landscape move. The highway gave way to surface streets. Surface streets gave way to familiar neighborhoods returning to him one block at a time, each one requiring a small recalibration not of memory, but of permission. Permission to recognize this place as his. Permission to be on the way home rather than being held in place. She told him about the trial, about Marcus, about the button on the lapel, about the badge on the railing, about Hargrove's legs giving out at the sentencing and the marshals holding him up. Jerome listened with his eyes on the window. When she finished, he was quiet for a block. Then he said, "Did she come?" "The woman from the 3rd row." Loretta looked at him. Then she said, "That was me." Another block of quiet. "I know," Jerome said. "I know it was." His first Thursday home. Loretta's kitchen smelled of everything she had been planning for 2 years. Specific dishes, specific smells. The cooking equivalent of a sentence she had been composing for a very long time and was finally allowed to finish. Jerome sat at the kitchen table and watched her work and did not offer to help, which was correct because some meals are an act of love that require only a witness. He called Patricia Alcott to thank her. The call lasted 4 minutes. It was professional and warm, and when it ended, Jerome sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and then set it on the table and looked at the window. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does. Going low and golden, making the ordinary look briefly extraordinary. The kind of light that doesn't announce anything but that exists as a kind of agreement between the day and the person watching it, that things can still be beautiful. Jerome thought about what comes next. He thought about it the way a person thinks about something they have been planning for 2 years, in the back of a space too small for planning carefully with the specific muscle memory of returning to a thing you have kept alive through a long absence, unsure whether the shape of it has changed, finding it mostly intact, needing only a small adjustment for the person you are now, rather than the person you were when you set it down. The business degree, the spring semester, the plan that a regional manager had put in writing. He had work to do. He was 29 years old, and he had work to do, and he was home, and it was Thursday, and his mother was cooking, and the light through the kitchen window was doing the thing that October light does, the worst thing that can be done to a person. The deepest thing, the one that takes the longest to repair, is not the arrest, not the cell, not the sentence. It is the theft of the future tense. The removal by another person's deliberate act of the right to make plans. Jerome Shaw had been robbed of the future tense for 2 years. He was taking it back now, quietly, without announcement. One Thursday at a time. Kevin Bryce was on a job site on the south side of the city on a Wednesday afternoon in October, working a foundation pour for a residential development 3 units going up on a vacant lot that had been vacant for 7 years, which in a city like Harmon City was not unusual and was also to the people who lived on the block adjacent to it, not nothing. He was wearing canvas work clothes with concrete already drying on his forearms, which had a weight and a texture that was different from the weight and texture of the uniform he had worn for 2.5 years, though he had not spent much time comparing them directly. The work required attention. He gave it attention. The man working beside him was named Vic, mid-50s. Hands like the tools he used built for the job, not decorative. 30 years in construction, which gave him the specific authority of someone who has made the same decisions in varying conditions for a very long time, and who has earned through that repetition the right to do things the way he knows to do them without explaining himself. He asked very few personal questions. Kevin had decided in his first week on this job that this was the quality he most valued in a coworker. In the late afternoon, someone's phone nearby picked up the evening news volume low, the tinny sound of a small speaker working hard. A brief clip from a follow-up story on the Hargrove sentencing, something about the Shaw River standards being adopted by a second city. A shot of the courthouse steps. A few seconds of the kind of coverage that a story gets 8 months after it was news-dutiful, compressed, already slightly historical. Vic glanced at the phone, then at Kevin, then back at the phone. Said nothing. Kevin set down his trowel. He looked at the foundation he had been helping to pour all day. The level concrete, the honest geometry of it, the way it would hold whatever was built on top of it without asking for credit. A foundation was not complicated, it was just the thing that made everything else possible, visible only when it failed. Invisible when it worked, which was how foundations were supposed to be. He thought about the question he had been asked a few times since he left the department, whether he missed the job. He gave it the serious consideration it deserved. And what he had arrived at after several months of giving it that consideration was this: what he missed was the version of the job he had believed he was joining. The version where a uniform meant something particular, and the badge was a trust rather than a tool. That version had existed. He was sure it had existed somewhere in some departments on some shifts, but it had not existed uncomplicated on his shift in his precinct, and he had known that for a long time and had chosen at a critical moment to look at the ground instead of at what he knew. He was not looking at the ground anymore. Building things that did not require him to decide who deserved protection was right now the only work he trusted himself to do correctly. Maybe later there would be other work. Maybe later the version of service he had believed in would exist in a form he could honestly participate in. That was a bridge for another time. Right now there was a foundation, and it needed to be level, and he was making it level, and that was a thing he could stand next to at the end of the day and know was true. Vic said, not looking up from his own work. "You doing all right?" Kevin said. "Yeah." Vic said, "Good." That was the entire conversation. It was exactly the right length. The pour finished at 4:30. Kevin cleaned his tools in the specific methodical way he had learned from Vic. Each tool wiped, each edge checked, each thing returned to its place in the order that would make tomorrow easier. He loaded his equipment into his truck. He sat for a moment in the cab before starting the engine. He thought about Marcus Cole standing beside him in the courthouse hallway saying, "What you did in there took more than what you've been given credit for having." He thought about Brianna Foster stopping a few feet away and looking at him not with anger, not with accusation, but with the direct measuring gaze of a woman deciding whether he was at a threshold or standing near one. He had been at the threshold. He had crossed it. That was not redemption. He did not use that word about it because it seemed too large and too self-focused for what the action had actually been, which was simply telling the truth when asked whether the truth was his to tell. But it was something. It was the smallest possible version of the thing that could have been done earlier, done later, which meant that the doing of it now was not nothing. He started the truck. He drove home through the October dusk, and the city moved around him, ordinary and complicated and worth the cost of being honest about what it required. Marcus drove north through Cloverfield as the street lamps solidified against the darkening October sky, the last evening of his final sight check before he turned the operation's physical equipment in and closed the case file for good. The button was on the passenger seat. He would leave it there until he reached the evidence room. It felt right to let it occupy space for one more evening, this small and ordinary-looking thing that had carried so much, that had been the physical instrument of a particular kind of attention, a way of making permanent what power had counted on being temporary. He passed Dennison Street without slowing. Somewhere on that block, in a brick row house with an electric fireplace and a ceramic vase on the mantel, Loretta Shaw was probably in her kitchen and Jerome was probably at the kitchen table, and it was Thursday. He thought about that for a moment, the specific Thursdayness of it, and then let it sit in the back of his mind the way good things sit when they have been earned rather than assumed. He thought about the 24, 18 released now. 6 more with hearings scheduled in the next 6 weeks, the task force's work nearly complete. 2 cases more complicated than the others, one involving evidence that predated the federal warrant by enough years to create procedural complexity. One involving a plea agreement that would require a separate evidentiary challenge, but both being worked by attorneys who had not stopped working them and who would not stop until they were done. He thought about the Shaw Rivers standards. The name would outlast everyone in this story. It would outlast Marcus Cole and Dale Hargrove and Loretta Shaw and Damon Rivers and Kevin Bryce and the judge and the jury and every person who had sat in Courtroom 4B on a November morning and heard a badge placed on a railing without drama. The name would be in policy documents and training manuals and municipal codes in cities none of them had ever visited, protecting people none of them would ever know. That was the point. The work was not supposed to make the workers famous. The work was supposed to make the floor solid. He thought about the lighter in Hargrove's hands. Hargrove would never fully understand why Marcus had given it to him. Marcus had given it because some truths are not for the person who receives them. The truth of the lighter was not for Hargrove. It was for the record. It was for the completeness of the documentation. It was for the 24 men on the list who deserved a case file that left nothing out. Hargrove would sit with the lighter in a federal facility in a state he had never visited and turn it over in his cuffed hands and try to make it mean something that reduced his culpability. And he would fail because objects do not have that capacity. Only people do, and Hargrove in the end had chosen not to use his. Marcus passed a young man walking home on the east side of Cloverfield. Backpack. Earbuds. Moving quickly because it was getting dark and the street lamps on this block were unreliable, one working. One flickering one out entirely. Which was a maintenance issue that Marcus had already filed a report about through the appropriate municipal channel because some things required federal operations and some things required a phone call, and knowing the difference was the first requirement of doing either one correctly. He did not slow down. He did not stop. The young man did not need to be stopped. He needed the street to be safe enough to walk home on. He needed the lamp to work. He needed the officer in the patrol car that passed him at 11:30 at night to see a person walking home rather than a result to be produced. He needed the floor to hold. That work was never finished. It was not finished in Harmon City, and it was not finished in the cities that had adopted the Shaw Rivers standards, and it would not be finished in the cities that would adopt them next year or the year after. It was the permanent, ongoing, unglamorous work of building and maintaining an institution worthy of the trust it asked for. Done one case at a time, one warrant at a time, one 11-night stretch in the rain at a time, by people who understood that the trust belonged to the people and not to the people holding the badge. The obligation did not end with the verdict. The verdict was just the moment the obligation transferred from Marcus Cole to the judge who ordered the review, from the judge to the task force, from the task force to the city, from the city to the officers who would put on a uniform tomorrow morning and choose in every encounter with every person on every block what the uniform meant. The light ahead turned red. Marcus stopped. He looked at the button on the passenger seat. This small thing. This ordinary thing that had carried so much. He picked it up, held it for a moment, then set it back down gently, precisely in the exact center of the passenger seat, and looked at the city moving around him at the intersection. Cars, pedestrians. A woman pushing a stroller. A group of teenagers outside a corner store. All of them going about a Tuesday evening in October in Harmon City without any particular awareness of the work that had been done over the past year on their behalf. Which was exactly right. The floor was supposed to be invisible. That was how you knew it was holding. The light turned green. Marcus Cole drove and the city moved around him, ordinary and complicated and worth every single thing it had cost to protect. Marcus Cole spent 6 months being invisible in a neighborhood that had learned to expect nothing from the institution designed to protect it. He didn't carry his badge on his chest because the badge was never the point. The point was the 24 men still inside, the ones who didn't have a wire, who didn't have 6 months, who didn't have a plan. He did it for them. He always had. Dale Hargrove spent 18 years mistaking a badge for a permission slip. He believed that the people of Cloverfield were his to manage rather than his to serve. That power exercised over someone is the same thing as authority. It is not. Authority is earned every single day in every single encounter, and the moment you stop earning it, you begin to lose it whether the record shows it or not. The record always catches up. Jerome Shaw walked out of Bridgewater on a Tuesday. He is enrolled in the spring semester. He called his mother on Thursday. These are not small things. These are the things a Thursday phone call, a spring enrollment, a kitchen that smells right, that the entire machinery of justice exists to protect. Not abstractions. Not principles written in documents that no one reads. A man and his mother and a Thursday that was taken and then at great cost and through great effort returned. Every person in Courtroom 4. B, that November morning, saw the same thing, that accountability when it works is not luck and is not accident and is not a miracle. It is built by people willing to spend 11 nights in the rain, by families willing to put on the good coat for 2 years. Even when the proceedings haven't earned it, by young men who finally stop looking at the ground, by communities that keep showing up because showing up is the only form of witness available to them, and they have decided that it matters. That is the only version of justice that lasts. If this story moved you, if you've ever waited for someone to finally be held to what they swore on a Bible, if you've ever been in that gallery in your good coat hoping that this time it would be different, then you've already called this the right place to come for stories that matter. You waited for this one, and we're glad you did. Hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps more than you know. Share this with someone who needs to hear what justice looks like when it actually works. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment you knew Marcus Cole had everything under control from the very beginning? We want to know what you saw, because we think you saw it before. Most people did. This story is a fictional dramatization for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental.